Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this seminar today in the Te Puna Haumaru seminar series. I'm really excited to present to you Dr. Tadhg Daly and Dr. Patrick Neilands from Ministry of Justice. They're here to talk to you about some of the latest insights from the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey. I'd also just like to quickly mention that Tadhg was one of the first presenters we ever had when I started this seminar series in 2023. So thanks for believing in us back then, and thanks for coming back. It's really great to have you as part of our series.
Kia ora. Thank you, April. I'm always happy to share, to have a platform for anybody to listen to what we have to share. So as April said, my name is Tadhg Daly. I'm a principal analyst in the research and evaluation team at the Ministry of Justice. I'll let Paddy do a quick intro of himself as well.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm Paddy. We both have Irish names. I'm a little bit further afield than Tadhg. But I've been in New Zealand for about 10 years, and I've been working at Justice for about 3 of those years, just on the Crime and Victim Survey as a senior analyst.
Cool. So the main thing that I wanted to share with today was sort of what's been going on for us in the last year. So mainly talking about all the releases we did this year. You'll see NZCVS 2024 there. That's because everything we released this year is from last year's cycle of interviews, which I'll explain a bit more in a minute. Just going to talk through what we've been up to. So in February this year, we released a key results report. That's sort of our high-level report on kind of the trends in victimisation and crime statistics. Then in April, we released a report on our public perceptions module, which Paddy's going to talk more a bit about later. Then in May, we released our key stories report, which is us trying to dig down a little bit deeper into some of the things that we've sort of seen happening. And then quarterly, every quarter, we've been doing violent crime releases, which Paddy will talk to as well. And you also have, last month in September, we released a series of research fact sheets that went along with a series of research reports that we commissioned in sort of 2022 and 2023 to sort of dig even deeper into our data. And I'll briefly go over that towards the end and talk about some of the other resources available from the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey and sort of our wider team here at Sector Insights. So just to briefly take you over the methodology of the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey and how it works. It's an annual nationwide face-to-face sample survey. So we go sort of door to door all around the country, talking to people every single year. We talk to people who are 15 years and older, and it's sort of a random-ish household survey. So we randomly select households, and then within that household, we randomly select a household member. There is some weighting that goes on that we're more likely to select a Maori household member as part of our Maori booster sample. So that's sort of where the randomish comes in. And the Maori booster sample is basically to oversample Maori so that we produce reliable estimates for that population. One of the key purposes of the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey is that we don't really have a source of unreported, a constant measured source of unreported crime in New Zealand. So one of the key things that the NZCVS does is measure both reported and unreported crime. We ask about a range of crimes. So we ask about household and personal crimes, including burglary, fraud, vehicle theft, and violent offences. What we don't look into is things like retail crime, so we don't collect anything on ram raids. We don't look at victimless crimes, so there's nothing on drug offences, murder or manslaughter. We can't talk to people who have been murdered or manslaughtered, so they are not included in the survey. The way that the survey works, when we go to the door, we don't ask people straight out if they've experienced crime. So we don't just say, have you been assaulted? Have you been burgled? Because those are sort of legal definitions of crimes, and people will have different interpretations of what those things mean. What we do is ask behavioral screeners of what's gone on with people in the last 12 months. So we might ask, has anybody harmed you in any way in the last 12 months? Or has anybody been on your property without your permission in the last 12 months? And then if they say yes to one of those screeners, we will ask them to give us an incident description. And later on, after they've completed the survey, that incident description will get looked at by a team of coders who will decide whether or not that was a crime and what type of crime that was. And those coders and the coding manual they use was developed in line with police, and they work with police to basically keep ensuring that whatever we're calling crime and how we're coding it is similar to what police would call crime, and the way they would code it as well. So for cycle 7 in 2024, so cycle 7 ran from October 23 to October 24. We interviewed 7,705 people, and we got a 73% response rate. This was also the first year that we ran the public perceptions module in full, so we had done a pilot before this, but this was the first full running of the public perceptions module, and in this situation, it was more of a bonus survey, so a lucky bonus. If you'd already done the NZCVS, we'd ask if you also wanted to do another survey on public perceptions of the justice system. So out of our 7,705, 6,586 people said yes to that, 86%. So that's a 63% response rate overall. So just in terms of like the high level numbers coming out of our key results, what we saw in 2024 was that about 30% of New Zealand adults were a victim of crime. You'll see shortly that this has not changed much over time, so it's really hovered around that 30% mark for the last 7 years that the survey's been running. So we started the survey in 2018. When you break that down, that's about 17% of adults experiencing a personal offence and 16% of households experiencing a household offence. And within those personal and household offences, you've got the largest within personal, the largest sort of most common type of crime is fraud and cybercrime, followed by interpersonal violence and then theft and damage offences. And within those household offences, the most common crime occurring to people is burglary, followed by vehicle offences, and then much further down the line is trespass. Something we also see consistently across all years of the survey is that there are a number of groups who are at higher risk of victimisation. So generally speaking, young people, Maori, people who identify as LGBTQ+, and disabled people are all more likely to experience crime than the New Zealand average. In the case of Maori and young people, we have seen trends downwards since the survey began, but still slightly above the New Zealand average at this point in time. We also measure people's feelings of safety. So we ask people on a scale from 0 to 10, how safe do they feel in general? And something we commonly see there is that victims don't feel as safe as non-victims, so people who have experienced crime don't feel as safe, which is something you would generally expect. So as I was saying, that blue line up the top is our overall victimization over the last 7 years. And over that time, it's basically hovered around that 30% mark. So it hasn't changed much over time. If we go down to the red and the yellow line below that, you'll see that the red line has been going down over time. That's our household offences, whereas the yellow line has been going up over time, which is the personal offences. And so just to dig in a little bit to what's going on there. So this is if you break that yellow line into the crimes within it, what we see, what's driving up that yellow line of personal offences is largely just fraud and cybercrime. So in 2021, or between 2021 and 2022, we saw basically a doubling of fraud and cybercrime, where we were seeing about 5 to 6% of people were experiencing it each year, and then that went up to about 11 to 12% of people. That's something that we'd been seeing. So it's something we've reported on previously in previous years. One of the explanations for that basically is that during that time between 2021 and 2022, we were still in sort of COVID. And one of the big changes that happened behaviorally, not just in New Zealand, but around the world, is that people were going a lot online a lot more. And they were doing a lot more online shopping. And so some of the interesting things coming out of that is, so people might assume that a lot of the fraud victims were older people, which isn't true. What we saw really was that a lot of the victims were more likely to be middle-aged, and a lot of the victims were more likely to have high incomes. So just people who had disposable income and more likely to be shopping online, and that's where we sort of noticed a lot of the fraud was happening. Up on the slide there is a fact sheet with one of the research reports I talked about that was done by Dr. Jared Gilbert from Canterbury University, and he made a lot of recommendations about this increase in fraud and how it hasn't really been fully addressed at this point in time. So a lot of the time the banks are dealing with these frauds and they are paying back people money, but nobody is being caught, and the banks are basically paying the bill for this huge amount of cost. And so he's sort of made a lot of recommendations around public and private enterprises, so banks and police and the justice sector coming together and sort of starting something like an anti-scam centre where we would actually track what's going on and provide advice to people and try to help people out. Something else that we saw, so I said before, you had that red line, which was household crime, that's been going down over time. Underneath that is basically what we see is a large decrease in burglary over that time period. So burglary's gone from about 12% of households in 2018 to 9% of households in 2024. And if you match that decrease in burglary along with that decrease in household offences, you'll see that those two lines basically move together. That's just showing you that that's basically completely driven by the drop in burglary. Something we noticed when we looked into this a bit more is that the drop in burglary was not evenly distributed across our regions. So we've seen like quite large decreases in burglary in places like Southland, Northland, and Waikato, 67%, 44%, 51%, whereas in places like Canterbury and Otago, you've seen maybe a 3% or a 6% decrease. In terms of what's sort of going on, we don't have great data in terms of to tell us exactly why burglary has been decreasing over time. So what we generally do in these situations is look around what's going on in other places to see if we can kind of pull a story together about what might be happening. In this situation, a couple of the things that we picked out is that although we've seen a decrease in household burglary, if you look at sort of all the data sources around retail crime has been going up over that exact same period of time that burglary has been going down. So potentially what we're seeing is a shift. So people might be just more likely to be sort of hitting up retail premises as opposed to households in order to steal things. Another explanation, so this is a picture of me trying to, looking at my manager pointing at a piece of paper, and I definitely can't read from that far away. So this was a bit of media that we did on the release of this, and we were talking to Maori TV, which we found out after the interview that it doesn't exist anymore, but nonetheless it appeared on the internet. So basically what we said, along with this sort of increase in retail crime, is that one of the other things that might be going on with a decrease in household burglary is that we have seen sort of a explosion in home security products that are very cheap and very accessible. So very different to the expensive sort of security systems that used to be around. And more people have been buying these and using these types of things. And research from overseas, so the UK also runs a crime and victim survey, and some research from that shows that basically home security systems in all kinds of combinations are quite effective, especially if you've got things like sensor lights and cameras. And that could be something that's driving people away from household burglary. So this is our reporting rates. So this is one of the key things that we sort of are able to produce out of the survey. So once we ask people what they've experienced, we ask whether or not they've reported it to the police. So basically, what we saw in 2024 is that about 39% of victims reported at least one offence to the police, and that didn't change. That's very stable in comparison to 2018. Those rates went down a bit over the COVID period, but have sort of come back up and stabilised now. And that's the same for the proportion of incidents reported to police. So in 2018, it was around 25%, and 2024, we're back at 26%. What we always see with our reporting rates is that they vary widely by offence type. So vehicle offences, particularly motor vehicle theft, are much more likely to be reported to police, usually for insurance purposes, and that's followed by burglary for similar reasons. On the lower end of things, as we talked about, with this big spike in fraud and cybercrime, you're still not actually seeing many people reporting it to the police. They are more likely to go and tell the bank or another authority about what's going on than they are to tell the police about it. And we see very low reporting rates as well for sexual assault, but I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. We also ask respondents if they didn't report to police, why? And some of the most common things, and these patterns are reasonably consistent, the sort of common themes that come up is that the incident was too trivial. I reported it to the bank. That's really a reflection on fraud and how big fraud is. Police could not have done anything, and police would not be interested. So this is another story we talked about in our key stories report, where we basically saw a dramatic increase in the proportion of sexual assaults that were reported to police. So from about 2018 and similar in 2022, you see the reporting rates very low, around the 7% mark. And then between then and 2024, shot up to 32%. What you can't see here is the confidence intervals around these proportions. So I should say that basically sexual assault is in the context of the survey a low prevalence crime. So it's around 2% of people experience sexual assault a year. It's still a lot of people, but just in the context of statistics, it's a low prevalence rate. And out of that 2%, you've only got between 7% and 30% who are reporting that crime to police. And just statistically, that means we end up with very large confidence intervals around these proportions. We do still see a significant jump from that 2022 point to the 2024 point, which is why we basically digged into this story a little bit more to see what was going on. But it's just something to be aware of, that we don't necessarily think the jump is that high, but we do think that it probably represents a trend. When we dug into it a little bit more, what we found was that something else that's gone up over the same period of time is we ask, when people say they've experienced a crime, we also ask them how serious they thought it was on a scale from 0 to 10. And what we saw over that same time period for sexual assaults is that the average seriousness for sexual assaults went up from about a 3.5 in 2018 to a 5.9 in 2024. And that was a significant increase. It's hard for us to tell. So this is a perception score. So it's how much did you perceive, how serious did you perceive the sexual assault to be, and that can be influenced by a number of things. So it could be influenced by the severity of the actual incident, but could easily also be influenced by things going on in the world. So awareness about sexual assault, people recognizing that it's a more serious event, that kind of thing. And just sort of to follow that up a little bit more, we looked into some of the other things. So the proportion of sexual assaults that resulted in injury jumped from about 11% to 19%. Time off work, 5% to 21%. And we also saw an increase in the proportion that were receiving medical attention. So that gives some support that there may be an increase in severity as well. But it's still something that we're not sure. We can't really disentangle it fully from awareness and things going on like the Me Too movement or high-profile cases. Something else is that that big jump in reporting of sexual assaults was not seen by police in the police data. So they did see an increase, but the increase just did not match the size of the increase we're seeing in our data. So just bringing it back to those confidence intervals, we think that maybe we're identifying a similar trend, but we're not totally confident on the size of the reporting increase. Something else that we looked a bit into this year was some new questions we put in the survey around discrimination. So we put in a question around general discrimination, another question about discrimination by the criminal justice system, and since the beginning of the survey, if people are a victim of crime, we asked them if they thought the crime was driven in any way by any form of discrimination. What we see from that is that about 17% of New Zealanders had experienced some form of general discrimination in the previous 12 months, the most common being racial discrimination, followed by sex, gender, age, religion, disability, and sexuality. When we ask people, have you ever been discriminated against by the criminal justice system? So this is more of a lifetime question. We found that 7% said they had been discriminated against by the criminal justice system at some point in their life. And similar pattern to the general discrimination, racial discrimination was the most common, followed by sex, gender, age, religion, disability, and sexuality. And this is the data around when we ask people who have been victims of crime if they thought the crime was in any way driven by discriminatory attitudes. We find that about 12% of all incidents are perceived to be driven by some form of discrimination. That number's bounced around a little bit over time, but has been relatively stable in terms of looking between 2018 and 2024. And that's the same across all those different types of discrimination. So those lines wobble around a bit, but stay around the same sort of level. What I should say is that when you start talking about personal crimes, specifically interpersonal violence, family violence, sexual violence, the proportion perceived as being driven by discrimination shoots up sort of dramatically. So you get much, much larger proportions of those types of offences are perceived as driven by discrimination.
Today, I'm just talking to you about the public and perception module, which is a new part of the NZCVS, which Tadhg mentioned earlier. And this really just asks individuals just a range of questions about their trust in the criminal justice system, in the law system, what crimes or offences they think are an issue in New Zealand, just a range of questions of how they're experiencing the justice system and crime. And so it actually, I think it's probably the part of the survey that our respondents enjoy the most answering, which is good because it's now being included in the full survey, so they get to answer it many times in the coming years. What we find when we look at trust in the justice system is that about half of New Zealanders have high trust in the law system and half of about high trust in the justice system. Some of you might be already asking what's the difference between the law system and the justice system. We don't have a great definition for that, just people are very keen that we asked about both, and we were fairly sure that respondents are kind of not distinguishing between them too closely because their answers are very, very similar regardless of which question exactly. But we find about 49% of adults have high trust in the law system and about 45% have high trust in the justice system. But there is a lot of variation among demographics. So we know that Maori in particular have a lower trust in the law system and justice system. But also we know that your experience of victimization also seems to impact your trust in the system. And so we define here highly victimized as anyone who's experienced 4 or more offences within the last 12 months. And they have some of our lowest rating for high trust in the justice system, down to about 34 and 30%. And so that just shows that we think that whenever you are victimized, that does really impact how much you trust the system. And so it's kind of important for us to kind of understand more deeply what's going on there. Yes. And as well as asking about the justice system in general, we also ask about components of the justice system. How do you trust, say, the police versus judges or defense lawyers? And we do, again, see a bit of variation there. In general, people have relatively high trust in all our institutions. But if we look at about 73% have high trust in police, 76% have high trust in groups that provide services for victims. By the time you get down to the prison service, that's dropped down to about 43%. And again, one thing to note here is that probably we think familiarity with the institution probably influences trust. So we see the parole board has relatively low trust, and we think that's probably at least partly because just not a lot of people know that much about the parole board. So I think a lack of awareness of some aspects of the justice system probably contributes to slightly lower trust. But there's just still this variation across the justice system. And then again, we, as well as asking about trust in the justice system, we also asked if people think it's effective or if it's fair. And again, we see that 40% of adults have high confidence in the effectiveness of the justice system, so that it's kind of good at carrying out its processes. It's effective at bringing people through the process of applying sentences correctly, et cetera, and then 47% of adults have high confidence that the justice system is fair. I guess that's trying to say it's more about, is it good at what it's doing, its effectiveness, and then fairness is broadly, is it focused on the right things, is it treating people within the justice system fairly? And again, while there's still relatively high proportions of high confidence in both effectiveness and fairness, this does vary again by demographic groups and by experience. So we can see that our highly victimized, again, are significantly less likely to have high trust in the effectiveness, and it's significantly less likely to have high trust in the fairness of the criminal justice system. And again, Maori also significantly less likely. In contrast, Europeans are significantly more likely, and LGBTQ plus are just slightly less likely as well. So yeah, again, it seems like groups that maybe are more likely to experience marginalization within the justice system are also less likely to have confidence that it's fair and effective. And one thing we don't have in the slides, but some kind of additional research we've shown, is that trust in, or the extent you think that the justice system is effective and the extent you think it's fair, they both predict how likely you are to have a higher trust in the justice system more generally. So clearly, effectiveness and fairness are kind of key components about how people rate their trust in the justice system. Yeah, and again, as well as knowing that victimization impacts a justice system, we also know that the extent to which adults have had contact with the justice system also impacts in trust. So the New Zealand average, about 45% have high trust in the criminal justice system, but for adults who've had contact with the justice system, that drops down to 40%. And again, there's a bit of variation. So for people who have had to go to court as witnesses or support people, that's really low. It's only 23%, maybe reflecting just the fact that going as a witness, going as a support person can just be a bruising experience. On the other hand, if you're getting reparations, maybe unsurprisingly, if you're getting a bit of money from the justice system, you're much more likely to rate it, have high trust. So about nearly shy of 60% of people who receive some kind of reparation, have higher trust in the justice system. And the final thing we look at just within the PPM as well is kind of what issues of concern people have. So we ask about various offences, and we ask people two questions. Do they think this is an interest? Is this an issue of concern in New Zealand in general, as an issue of concern in your neighbourhood particularly? And what you see is the gap between the two is kind of the most striking thing, that people are more likely to think an issue is a problem in New Zealand as a whole, and less likely to think it's an issue in their neighbourhood. And this can reflect just variations in geography. Some areas of New Zealand are more likely to experience crime than others, but also might reflect kind of just the impact of media narratives, that if we believe, if there's a lot of media narratives around crime going around, then we're more likely to believe these are issues in New Zealand, even if we're not experiencing them in our neighbourhood ourselves. And so that's quite a quick whiz through the PPM, just because I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. But the second thing that we've kind of done a lot of work on this year is on violent crime. Some of you may be aware that the government has a target to reduce the number of victims of violent crime by 20,000, from 185,000 to 165,000 by 2029. And the data they're using to measure that comes from the NZCVS. And this has presented a bit of a challenge to us, mostly because of a methodological challenge, because this is an annual data set, and they're wanting quarterly updates. But one of the nice things about the NZCVS is because we collect data on basically a near continuous basis, we're able actually just to kind of every quarter just basically produce a 12-month to date estimate of the number of victims of crime. And so this is, to a certain extent, a rolling measure of victims of crime, which helps smooth out some of the volatility. We do have a bit of extra volatility added in, so we have to re-weight each time, but it does kind of smooth out some of the spikes we otherwise see. And this violent crime measure has attracted quite a bit of media attention. It's kind of been strange reading newspaper articles where about 60% of the content is sometimes from my emails. So you do kind of have to adapt to that pressure. But so far what we found is that in the most recent quarter, which was June, we've had a decent drop. We're down at 156,000 victims of crime, which is below the target at the moment. So we're kind of on track, although we are always cautious because there's obviously, as survey data, there's a bit of noise. You want to have a good, strong trend before you draw any conclusions. But if we look a bit more at the data itself, what we can see is our baseline is October 2023, and that orange line is our quarterly estimates. And we can see there's a big spike up until about June 2024, and then it's kind of dropped back down subsequently, and since February 2025 has been below the target level. And we think there's kind of three main things that have been kind of driving that. Firstly, we've seen an increase from October 2023 to June. There was an increase in both family victims of violent offences by a family member and victims of violent offences by a non-family member. And they then both dropped since June, but the drop is probably a bit steeper for the victims of non-family violent offences, and also because that represents a larger proportion of the offences that will have a bigger impact on our overall trend. As well as that, we've seen a sharp increase or sharp decrease since June 2024 in non-sexual assault and robbery. And that's really driving that compared to sexual assault. Well, that's actually stayed pretty flat from 2018 up to 2025. We haven't seen a lot of variation there. It's a pretty flat trend line. In comparison, for non-sexual assault and robbery, what we saw was kind of a decrease, pretty consistent decrease from 2018 to 2022. That kind of was reversed by an increase from June 2024. We dropped back down to since June 2024. And actually the data points since February, if you draw a trend line from 2018 to 2022, those data points are lying pretty close to where we predict from that earlier data. And so there's some suggestions we maybe had a transitionary bubble in violent crime, and that's now beginning to reverse itself. And the final kind of interesting thing we've seen is that both the increase from October 22 or 23 to June 24 and the subsequent decreases have been particularly driven by a drop in violent crimes where alcohol has been involved. Either the offender or the victim have had alcohol at the time of the offence. And that kind of dropped since June 2024. About 65% of the decrease can be attributed to a decrease in victims, victims where alcohol was involved in the offence. And so, kind of putting it all together, it does suggest that it's the decrease has been driven mostly by non-family violence, by a decrease in non-sexual assault, and by a decrease in alcohol-related violent offences.
So, just to quickly wrap up before we answer some questions, I just wanted to highlight the research reports and the fact sheets that I mentioned earlier. So in 2022, 2023, we commissioned a series of research projects based on a fund we developed to sort of dig deeper into some of the issues that we highlighted as being things that sort of needed a closer look through the New Zealand Crime and Victim Survey. And so we had a number of researchers and projects put together some really interesting reports. Some of your April and Devin and Lisa all involved in some of those. So we've got some sort of in-depth research reports. I mentioned the one by Jared on fraud and cybercrime, sexual exploitation, the cost of crime, LGBTQ plus victimization, underreporting of family and sexual violence, re-victimization, overlap between victims and offenders, and experiences of disabled victims. So you can take a look at the fact sheets that summarize the research. We've also linked the full reports, and just wanted to highlight those sort of pieces of work for anyone interested in having a closer look into those. I also just wanted to highlight sort of a bunch of the resources that we have available coming out of the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey. So all the stuff we've talked about today is available in sort of reports and formatted tables on our website. It's not the best laid out website in the world, but all the information is around on there. I think violent crime might be on a separate page to our other NZCVS stuff, but everything is there if you look around. I also just wanted to highlight that we now release a series of tool tables. So basically what the tool tables are, basically they're the things that me and Patty use to write our reports, and they sort of have thousands of estimates in each of them, and help you really drill down into the trends and what's going on with the data. So it just can be a really useful resource if you want to look into specific types of victimization by specific groups of people in specific regions. We would hopefully in one day we'll have sort of a more fancy version of the tool tables and sort of a table builder, or a sort of Power BI platform. But for now, that's sort of where a huge amount of the information we're putting out sits inside of. And we have some instructions there on how to use them for those that find them incredibly unuser-friendly. I also just wanted to say that we have a lot of data in the IDI, and we've just gone through a big process of putting a lot more data in the IDI. So basically, almost everything that we've ever asked in the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey is now going into the IDI as of October. Very few things won't be going in there. So I just wanted to highlight that for researchers who are interested in looking into our data and writing their own reports, taking me and Patty's jobs, whatever you want to do. We also have what's called the NZCVS panel. So basically, everybody who participates in the NZCVS gets asked if they would like to participate in future research. About 92% of all of the participants say yes. And then we get their sort of contact information. So this gives us a huge sort of roughly representative panel of people that can be used for research projects. This is probably more in the realm of funded research projects. So you would need money to do a project with this panel. But we do have an application on the website if you want to put a proposal in for using it. And just wanted to shout out also to a bunch of sort of other products that come from our wider team, the Sector Insights team, that are also on the website there. So there's heaps of data tables and statistics on tier 1 sort of crime data, looking at sort of inflow going through the courts and the prisons and police. We also have reports on justice sector projections. So that's just looking at where we think things are going in terms of what's the inflow into courts and what's the inflow into prisons. And a lot of interesting stuff under sort of family violence and sexual violence research A really key report that we released there is the sexual attrition report. So I talked a little bit about the reporting rates for sexual assault, and these sort of reports look into once something is reported to police, what happens, how many of them go through to a court trial, how many of them go through to a conviction, and tracks that over time. So very interesting resources there, and just wanted to highlight those. And other than that, we are open to questioning.